All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Rob Imbriano, Associate Professor and Director of the Ira A. Lipman Center for Journalism, Civil and Human Rights here at the Journalism School. I just want to remind everyone that following tonight's conversation, there's going to be a light reception, so please stick around if you can. I'm going to keep this short. We could spend the next 2 hours just talking about the accomplishments of Nell Irvin Painter, a prolific and award-winning scholar. Her books include The History of White People, Creating Black Americans, African American History and Its Meanings, 1619 to the Present, Southern History Across the Color Line, Standing at Armageddon, the United States, 1877 to 1919, Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, which has even been translated into Korean. Nell Irvin Painter is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and many more. She's one of our country's leading historians, one of our most original thinkers about the constructs of race. In addition to her earned doctorate from Harvard in history from Harvard University, she's received honorary doctorates from Wesleyan, Dartmouth, SUNY New Paltz, and Yale. Her latest memoir is the magnificently titled I Just Keep Talking, A Life in Essays. And if you love the cover art, she did that too. Dr. Painter will be in conversation with Jelani Cobb, the Henry R. Luce Professor of Journalism, the founding director of the Lippman Center, and Dean of the Journalism School. Here are Nell Irvin Painter and Jelani Cobb.
So I want to say thank you to Rob for that introduction. I want to say thank you to you all for coming out tonight. And I want to say thank you to Dr. Painter for just very many things. If I can start the conversation with a little bit of context, I think the first time I encountered your scholarly work was probably in the reverse order of what most people would, which was the narrative of Hosea Hudson, his life as a Negro communist. And this was because in graduate school I was studying all this Cold War stuff, and that was square in the center of the literature that I was absorbing. And only after that did I read Exodusters, which I think probably people go in the opposite direction more often. And one of the things I'll say is that as a scholar, Professor Painter was inescapable. She was someone whose work you had to countenance and you had to reckon with in some way, shape, or form, kind of moving through the PhD program in history at Rutgers as we were, or any program anywhere where you were studying any of the many fields in which her scholarly eye has devoted its attention. And we didn't meet until probably my second year, and that was when Dr. White.
Feels like a long time ago, though.
No, hardly. It was like, like 2 years. But I didn't meet you until probably my second year of grad school. And so it's been amazing to see and observe, the arc of your career and the body of work that you have produced in now multiple mediums, both as a historian and as a visual artist. And I'm just very envious because I don't know, maybe I can get you to do a book cover for me or something here. And so I thought that one of the things, because technically the book is not out yet, I thought it might be fun to just read a few passages that I found to be of interest, and then talk about them. And my first one, which was like my favorite one early on, the first thing that kind of grabbed my attention was this one in the introduction. I think you probably know which line I'm going to say. I mean, there are lots of great lines in here, but the Franz Boas line that really caught my attention. And so we all have, oh, excuse me. Yeah, thank you. I folded over that page. Oh, here it is. Right.
Okay.
We all have our sense of, when you've done something and people refuse to kind of see the thing that you so transparently did. And so in talking about the way in which people have kind of absorbed your work, it says, this isn't to say that all has gone smoothly and painlessly. Some insults I've never forgotten or forgiven. For instance, the refusal of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton to let me use an office there to complete Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, even though I requested no money. I had a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, a courtesy appointment that was routine for Princeton Universities on leave. I'm still pissed. It still annoys me that The History of White People, a bestseller, was totally overlooked for book prizes, didn't get a single one. And a prominent historian reviewed it negatively, claiming I had ignored Franz Boas. Franz Boas. I did not fucking ignore Franz Boas. Boas is in several chapters, in a chapter entitled Franz Boas, Dissenter. And so I really love that passage, most of all because probably people who work with me know that I'm probably a fan of decorous language in some ways, but also the way it kind of talks about the realities of academia and how these things are part of our careers and so on. So I guess I'll start all of that to say my opening question, which is, so much of this work appears in New York Times and popular magazines, the New Yorker, popular mediums, and your voice is so perfectly calibrated to that. And I wonder how you were able, as an academic historian at a time when this wasn't really that acceptable and really opened the door for like me and other people in my generation to do the kind of work that we do. I wonder how you started, speaking to these multiple audiences.
Well, is this on for me? Yeah. First, I want to say 1,000 thanks, grazie mille, to Jelani Cobb. I know that this room is full of your fans. Raise your hand if you are a fan of Jelani Cobb.
But no one who
Okay.
works with me has to raise their hand. I just like make sure it's like this is not an egotism thing here.
Yeah. If I could take anything away from Columbia University, I would take him away from Columbia University so he could write for us every week.
Thank
Really.
you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I'm not answering your question. I know. If I forget to come back, remind me. But, so often younger people now say, oh, things are so terrible and nothing has changed. And it's just like slavery. You've all probably heard some people say that. And one of the big things that's different, like I remember the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when the only person who could get through, who could get his voice out into the big world was James Baldwin. Now you can do that. And you're not the only one who can do that. And I am so grateful. I am so grateful for you and for your peers who speak truth to power.
Thank you.
Now, you asked me a question. What was it?
How did you start talking to the multiple audiences that you have engaged?
Right. Well, the first thing, one of the reasons this book is called I Just Keep Talking is because for decades, I just talked and I didn't feel anybody was paying attention. Now, that's not quite true because, I moved up the ranks in academic life. I was tenured and promoted in 3 years and then promoted again in 3 years. So I was a full professor like that. And, you could say that I've lived a charmed life as a historian, but I still felt like I was talking to myself. And that brought a great deal of freedom. So I just said what I wanted. So the second book, my second book that you read first, the narrative of Hosea Hudson, his life as a Negro communist in the South, my dissertation advisor said, don't do that book. Because when I started it, I didn't have tenure. He said, a communist is going to kill your career. And he didn't even die. He was still alive. So there was nothing saleable about Hosea Hudson. And in fact, my editor for my first book, Exodusters, it was with Knopf, and Knopf had, well, like so many publishers, they probably still do, have first right of refusal. So I took Hudson, my unrepentant Stalinist communist, to the Knopf offices. And he told gentleman Ashbel Green that he was a fool to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans because they were just the same. And if he wanted to make anything better, he should be a communist. And Ash turned the book down and said, Hudson does not tug at your heartstrings. And somebody reviewing said that about me. But one thing about not tugging at heartstrings is you don't have to tug. You just write what you want to write. So some of these essays are very old, actually. Well, that's not in my book. But if you notice the man in the Civil War uniform, and then behind him is a map of southern Nigeria, because he went there. And that was something that I don't think anybody ever read, but it was something I had spent years of my life in the 60s in Ghana. I started as an African historian, and I was attuned to what Africa might mean for African Americans. And I knew where those places were on the map behind him because I had been there. So that is a piece of art that is my art from my life. And I only made it in 2022, but if I had made it at the time when I wrote about Martin Delany, nobody would have known what I was talking about. So I just kept talking for a long time, and I did well enough as a historian to be able to keep talking. So I didn't feel that I had a big audience, and that gave me freedom.
You talk in the opening autobiographical essay, which is, I mean, the introduction, but also it's kind of autobiographical. A number of things in here, including this story of how it came to be that you did not attend Howard University, and involving E. Franklin Frazier. And I wonder if you might talk about that.
I can. E. Franklin Frazier was a great sociologist. He'll be familiar to some of you, but not to others. And in 1957, he wrote a book called Black Bourgeoisie. Is that right?
Yeah.
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 That's
We had to read it at Howard, ironically.
Interesting.
Yeah.
He was
when I was there, we still were.
Yeah, he was a Howard professor at the time when that was the capstone of Negro education. And he was married to a very light-skinned, very bourgeois wife. And he hated the weaknesses of the Black bourgeoisie. And one of them was colorism. Now, I don't know if colorism was still rampant when you were there.
I mean, it was a conversation when I was there. Like, it wasn't something that was unfamiliar. Like, I don't know if I didn't have a metric for like whether it had declined from, that previous era, but it wasn't gone when I was there.
Yeah. So we are talking about 1960. My father was the chief technician of chemistry at the University of California at Berkeley, which was the only place I ever wanted to go to college, and I did. And he was there for many years before there were a lot of Black people on the faculty or working at the university. My father was not a faculty member, but he was an educated man, and people, graduate students or visiting Black faculty were drawn to him. So we knew people. And E. Franklin Frazier came to our house for dinner. Now, I was one of those smart kids right at that point as things were sort of starting to open up a little bit. And I had gone to school with all white kids. And you know how that might have been graduating from high school at that time. So I wanted to go have a Black experience. So I said to E. Franklin Frazier at dinner, I said, "Oh, Professor Frazier," I said proudly, "I'm going to Howard." And he said, Nell Irvin, sit down. He said, "You are too smart and too dark to go to Howard." And he was right. This is 1960. You look at my peers, you look at who's married to whom. He was right. I went to Berkeley.
You talk about, now this is the last thing in the introduction, but before we move on, but something else you said, right at the outset, which caught my attention, and you said, there's not much there in my life to match what the country likes to recognize as a Black narrative of hurt. I remember speaking about Olden Art School in Seattle to a wonderful, warm audience, largely of women. A questioner asked me what I do for healing. "Nothing," I said. "I'm not broken." Not broken, but on occasion, frustrated, indignant, self-righteously, pissed off with a cause, often exhausted. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you see yourself. I thought that idea of the presumption of brokenness attending narratives of Black life, especially what you go on to describe as your family and your background in Texas and in California, and who they were, and your cousin who got the PhD in astrophysics the same day you got your PhD in history. And I'm interested in how you see that narrative and its proliferation.
Well, I should say right here is my cousin, who is the son of my cousin, who got his PhD in astrophysics at the University of Heidelberg in 1974, the same year I got my PhD at Harvard. I just told you a little bit about my parents. We were not fancy people. My father was not a doctor. My father was not a PhD or an MD or anything like that. But help me with this class, situating Black people in the middle of the 20th century by class is hard because if you're not poor and you say, well, you're kind of middle class, it sounds like you're much fancier than you really are. But among other Black people, you can be considered.
Right.
What's the word?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a weird kind of dynamic too, because a lot of this is also like culture, so like my father, who grew up poor, like Poe, like we couldn't afford the OR.
Oh dear.
in a place called Hazelhurst, Georgia. And he would use this term, which now I think probably has all kinds of classist implications, but here it didn't mean anything about socioeconomics. Like the worst insult that he could think of for a person, or any of his kinfolk could think of, would be to call you common. But what common meant, it had nothing to do with like being a common person.
Mhm.
It meant that you didn't do your children's hair before they went outside. Or you didn't, take care to make sure that their clothes were clean, or that you used coarse language, or you did, like, it was a particular kind of commentary on people's manners
Mhm.
more than it was socioeconomics, because they were kind of uniformly impoverished. And so the kind of gradations in that kind of almost become stand-ins for class too.
There is that, but I mean, my parents were college educated in the Houston College for Negroes,
Mm,
a title which Texas used to let us know that it wasn't, say, Rice or the University of Texas. It was a very new school, created just for separate but equal purposes. But they weren't poor. My mother's father was a college professor at Straight University, which is now part of Dillard. So we're not talking about poverty,
mhm,
and we are talking about some of those uncommon things, the culture
right.
side of it as well. But I feel that very often what the great American public wants from the Black story is something sad and hard,
Mhm,
or maybe triumph over something sad and hard.
mhm,
But I didn't triumph over anything sad and hard. My parents were married for 72 years until my mother died.
mm,
Um, we had our own house. We had to save up for it because FHA didn't lend to
right.
Black homeowners at the time. So I can't bring you a story of hurt.
Mhm.
And I feel that kind of weirdly as a kind of lack in a way.
Mm. I think it's interesting because it's also, it's normal. It's like people who just kind of living their lives and kind of
Yeah.
doing these things and having their aspirations
Yeah.
and so on. I do want to jump into some of these pieces, so we might not go chronologically. I was like the ones that kind of were on my mind as I was kind of preparing for this. One of which, and I wonder if we could kind of play a game where we talk about the moment and then we talk about now, the moment when these were written and kind of how, where we've gone from there. One of them is this really thoughtful examination of the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. And it's called Hill, Thomas, and the Use of Racial Stereotype. And here you talk about the way that that Anita Hill was categorized. And so it says, although she is well known among African Americans, the Black woman as traitor to the race is less familiar to white Americans, and thus is not a useful trope in the televised shorthand of race through which Clarence Thomas communicated. Having made Anita Hill into a villain, he proceeded, wittingly or not, to erase her and return to a simpler and more convenient cast. By the end of his story, Anita Hill had lost the only role, that of villain, that his use of stereotype had allowed her. She finally disappeared as he spun out a drama pitting the lone and persecuted figure of Clarence Thomas, the Black man, against an army of powerful white assailants. Democratic senators became the lynch mob. Thomas became the innocent lynch victim. As a symbol and as an actual person, Anita Hill was no longer to be found.
Does that ring true? Yeah. And now that Clarence Thomas well, he never went away, but he's very much in our view as someone who's basically corrupt. And it was pretty clear, not just pretty clear, it was really clear in 1991. And the one woman, well, he also disappeared his sister,
Yeah.
but he made her into another stereotype before
Yeah.
disappearing her. He made her into the welfare
Mhm.
sheet when she was a woman who, like so many other working class or poor women, not just Black women, but American women who drop out of school in order to take care of family
Mm.
and who then have to turn to a government assistance because that's the only answer. So for Clarence Thomas, this became some crime of hers because she, and I think I'm practically quoting him here, she lacked his ambition
Mm.
and his willingness to take advantage of the possibilities that were out there. It was her fault.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's interesting too that the path, we had the bust of Ida B. Wells.
Yes, I was going to
Uh,
mention that. I took a picture of it. Check it out on Instagram. Gonna put it on Instagram.
So at the unveiling, we had a discussion with Kim Crenshaw and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and they both pointed out the extent to which Thomas's ability to impose misery on a wide swath of Americans was facilitated by walking over Black women.
Oh, yeah.
Route, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We saw it at the time. We saw it in 1991 that this was a liar. How many more nouns do I need to damn him? But it was clear from 1991 that this was somebody who was no good.
Mm. From there, I'm going to jump. We're not going to go in chronological order, but there's a piece that you wrote in 2020 called "It Shouldn't Be This Close, but There's Good News Too."
Oh, yeah.
And it was about the dynamics, the complexities swirling around the presidential election. And it says, the congratulatory notion of American exceptionalism doesn't usually tempt me. There's just too much bloodshed and anti-democracy to make me think that Americans somehow avoided the perils of class conflict and hereditary aristocracy. What is white supremacy if not a hereditary aristocracy based on the ideology of race? Nonetheless, I take pride in what my fellow Americans have now pulled off, so far at least, an upwelling of faith in the epitome of citizenship, voting. Despite the erection of walls around businesses and even the White House, this election and its reckoning are unrolling peacefully. This is not to be taken for granted in the world we live in. Other countries routinely experience political violence. In the United States, we don't expect that, and our exemption is not to be taken for granted. Americans should be proud of the marvel of peaceable elections.
Obviously written before January 2021. But I think it's in that same essay where I cite the taxi driver. That's in that essay. So, and that was 2000, the election of 2000. And some of you remember that it was long drawn out and we didn't know what was going to happen. And I remember getting off the New Jersey Transit at Princeton, at Princeton Junction, and then getting into a taxi with a Haitian taxi driver. And he had All Things Considered on his radio, which was something I didn't often encounter taxi drivers with All Things Considered on the radio. And I remarked on it, and he said that he was absolutely riveted to the news because remember how long the settlement of 2020 took. And he said, Americans went through it peaceably. Nobody died that we know of. And it went on and on and on. And thinking about his country or many, many other countries, this simply could not have happened because people would have been in the streets, they would have been carrying guns, they would have been shooting people, people would have been rounded up, there would have been assassinations and so forth. So despite the riot, the assault on the Capitol that came after this piece was written, I still think that Americans should be proud of the peaceable transfer of power. We did it by the skin of our teeth, and it isn't over, and it may come around again, but the expectation and the possibility of a peaceful transfer of power is something we should be proud of. Now, very often when I talk about what I think is going to happen now and how I see our nation, world, people say, and I don't think it's all going to go to hell. So for instance, a little while back, people were talking about, oh, geez, we could have a civil war. And I said, well, you know, we had one. A lot of people died, but we got rid of slavery. And that was probably the only way to get rid of slavery. And we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Good. And then they say, oh, well, you must be an optimist. And I say, no, I cannot be an optimist. I have been Black in America too long to be an optimist.
I wonder if the extent to which you see your work on whiteness or the kind of body of work that you have created in understanding how race has matriculated through American society, how you see that in, I mean, you have 2 essays in here that deal with Trump kind of indirectly, I mean, directly.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about how you see these events in the light of that work.
I made an artist book in 2020 called American Whiteness Since Trump. And there are some pages from that in the book. And I also made From Slavery to Freedom in 2020, which is about the possibility of pulling away from a history of Black murder. So I forgot your question. Carrying
It was
on.
about kind of understanding the kind of MAGA, Trump, all the kind of volatility that we see in American politics
Yeah.
through the lens of the work you've done on whiteness.
Yes, gotcha. I will say that I think the only reason I could write the history of white people and continue writing about whiteness is the personal history I just told you about, which gave me the freedom to write about white people. Because I think mostly we still expect Black writers to write about Blackness. And I wrote a big book on whiteness. That still shapes how I see what's going on now. And there is a piece in here. I think it's the only piece that was never published. I spoke it, but at Princeton, but it was never published, about the mediatization, the imagery of the 2 parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, in which the Republican Party is mediatized as white. We see it as white. We see the assault on the Capitol as white. I mean, there were some non-white people there, but the face of that movement is white. At the same time, the face of the movement for voting rights, which is the quintessential action of citizenship, is Black. So I see the colorization of our 2 parties. I think that is my answer to your question. Yeah.
You know, you brought up something when we were emailing ahead of this event about the things that people anticipate and what readers anticipate that you'll write about, and whether there was a kind of tacit presumption among readers of many different backgrounds that, you know, we expect you to write about like Black things.
Yeah.
And the purchase and writing about things outside of that may not be the same. And I wonder what your experience has been like that. And I would like happily, I could tell you anything because you inquired about what mine had been like, and I'll happily tell you that.
Yeah, I want to hear what you say.
Well, the interesting thing is that at the New Yorker, I could literally write about anything. That doesn't mean people are going to read it.
They will. They will. Yeah.
Well, what I mean by that is this. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a Russian American journalist. And, you know, she said, if people don't stop asking me about Vladimir Putin, you know, like this is what she was like, people come to me to ask about Vlad. And she's like, there are a whole bunch of things. It's like, and when I do, like whenever I write about something else, I'll write a story about, you know, the economy or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, you know, you wrote about this. What do you think Vlad would think about the economy? And so it kind of works its way back there. And so I remember I wrote something about the origins of the Freedom of Information Act, which is a really interesting story. And our colleague Michael Schützen, you know, has written about it in his book on the history of American media in the 20th century, but the rise of the right to know. But the Freedom of Information Act comes about because there's a state legislator who's sitting at home watching Joseph McCarthy bully people and rail and use classification. Like, I would tell you how I know this, but everything is classified, and you know. And he decided, his name was John Moss, he decided to run for Congress with the sole objective of passing a law that would make it impossible for demagogues of the future to use the classification system in that way. And it took him 12 years to build up the seniority to be able to get that bill through Congress. And in 1966, he finally did, with a last-minute save by a congressman with whom he developed a friendship, who pulled together the kind of linchpin votes that allowed the bill to pass. The congressman was named Donald Rumsfeld. And in 1966, they put that bill on Lyndon B. Johnson's desk. He signed it. Completely transformed journalism, also history, you know, in terms of that access to information.
Yeah.
I wrote that piece. I was so proud of it. It went up on the New Yorker site and just sank like a rock. Like nobody read it. It was like, I wasn't talking about racism. I wasn't denouncing any police. There was like, it's like, this is not Jelani. Like, this is not what we've come to expect. Bring us back, Jelani.
Dear, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. But I do understand. I really do. The History of White People, the book before Olden Art School came out in 2010. And I was a graduate student at RISD, and my RISD teacher is here. It's maybe some of you can, in your mind's eye, can see the cover of that book. It's all white. And it's got a black circle in it. And then it says The History of White People and my name. But, you know, the book is white and the title says The History of White People. Every question on my book tour was about Black people. Well, not everyone, but enough for me to say, well, I suppose Black people are just much more interesting than white people. I don't think that's true. I'm speaking here as a topic of conversation and writing, but I think that there is a kind of will to avoid talking about whiteness, certainly before Trump. I think Trump revolutionized white Americans' ability to see themselves as raced. There's still a lot of people, like in Florida and such, who are shying away from that and still insist that they are individuals and they shouldn't be polluted by being racialized. And that's another essay in there is capitalize white. But the idea that the most interesting topic about in American culture, society is Black people, I think hasn't gone away. And it's kind of like, this is your responsibility, Black people, to explain this to us. And I think part of the reason that the history of white people didn't get any book prizes was because I was out of place.
We have like time for a few questions, and I'll make sure that we open up before we conclude and go for the reception.
You have to ask a question before you could have a glass of wine.
Yeah, there it is. Also, we have two professors here, so we can just call on people.
Oh. Sorry, I'm here. My question is about this whole sort of sense of, it can't get worse. This is the worst, it's such a bad thing. And we were with friends on holiday last month, just last month. And this person grew up during the civil rights movement. And he was very, 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 like he really wanted to say to us, this is so not comparable to that moment. And now I wonder if you would sort of help us understand that and place it into context. And the other thing that he asked us to do was to think about the way there's so many systems in place now that give people who are of a minority group rights, access, and opportunity that just didn't exist during the civil rights movement. But at the same time, it feels very, very desperate. And so I'm not exactly sure how this question relates to what you've written or what you've been thinking about, but I am interested because I see it in my kids. I have one son who's just moved to Boise, Idaho. I have a daughter who is, particularly aggrieved and is thinking of moving overseas. And it's this whole sense that progress has been sort of somehow clipped and not possible, and that their response to that is to opt out. Whereas the response in the 60s was to really confront it and to sort of make change. And I just wonder if you could sort of contend with that sense is it's not as bad as it was, and it's still pretty bad.
Well, you ended up where I would start, actually. It's still pretty bad, but it's not as bad as it was. But also in part of our earlier conversation by email, I was saying to Jelani that part of what feels so bad, I suspect, is a concentration on the level of the national. And I actually brought a couple of local news. We were up in the Adirondacks, and up in the Adirondacks, if we voted there, we don't, but if we voted there, our representative would be Elise Stefanik. But
She's very popular on this campus.
But in the local newspaper, which comes around once a week, we learn, for instance, in Saranac Lake, there's a group of people who have been writing letters in defense of Palestinians for weeks. We didn't know that. There's a discussion about the town near us, Elizabethtown, trying once again to build a sewer system. And what are the questions that come up? So on the local and state level, it's not as horrible, I think, as it seems if you're just looking at the nation as a whole, in which you can't get away from Donald Trump. But there's so much more going on. So that's part of what I would say to young people. But were you at the conversation about 1964? Yeah. So when I talked about 1964, I actually read part of a long list, which is in one of my books. It's called Creating Black Americans, and it's a narrative history of Black Americans, and all the images are Black fine art. So it actually gets used in art classes because so many teachers of art don't know anything about Black art. So here is a kind of quick and dirty way to learn the names. Well, I know the art that is on show at the Met right now because a lot of it is in Creating Black Americans. But anyway, so there's this list on one page of the atrocities and the murders that happened just in 1964 to 1966. The blood was in the streets. The blood was everywhere. People were attacked, people were dying. So it wasn't just, oh, we feel bad about this. It was people died. So I would say, get my book and show them that list.
Thank you, Dr. Painter. It's been fascinating hearing you. As Jelani knows, I'm a proud Lippman Fellow, and I used it to spend 3 years in Mississippi.
Oh.
And I wanted to ask you about a Black bourgeois who went before me, who probably E. Franklin Frazier would have hated. It's Allison Davis from the University of Chicago. I had to read a lot of books
No, I don't think so.
because I knew.
Frankie Franklin Frazier would have disliked him. No,
Oh,
he was harder on women, actually.
I see.
Frazier was?
Yeah.
Interesting,
Yeah.
because one book I read was about Davis's experience in Vicksburg in the 1930s. He went down there with his wife.
Yeah.
And
They're in cast.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, and a white couple.
Mhm.
And the Davises had a lot of trouble first finding a place to live
Yeah.
because they were Black, and then finding Black people who would talk to them because
Yes.
they were, well, we've had one of his sons as our parks commissioner. We know the Davises are very light-skinned.
Mhm.
So I wondered if you had written any more about colorism. I'd love to, it sounds like colorism backfired in Vicksburg, and I'd love to hear more about it.
The short answer is no, but when I can, I let you know what color people are because it counts, especially for women. Especially for women.
Interesting.
E. Franklin Frazier was writing about the middle of the 20th century, and this was before the Black Greeks got to be philanthropic. I mean, they were frivolous. They were all about consumerism and
Except for the alphas.
Yeah.
well, you're young enough for them to have been regenerated, but I'm talking about this is 1957, and my father's best friend was a Black Greek. Whom my father had to lend money to all the time. So he could afford all the things that let me not get. But at any rate, so I should add the book that I mentioned when I was talking about 1964 was Coming of Age in Mississippi. And I still recommend that book. And James, I would recommend that book to your children. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Painter, very much for your presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I wanted to make a commentary on what you said in light of your question, and then I have a question. I think these times are much worse than the 60s, precisely because of your analysis that whites now see themselves as a race, and therefore they have something to lose that they've been able to codify in that frame of whiteness. And they think they're losing everything. And I think there will be, I hope not, but I can foresee blood in the streets this time around, even more than during the 60s. So I'll stop on that.
Mhm.
But I had a major argument yesterday with a couple of friends of mine, white friends, male. One was straight, one was gay, and we were talking about American Fiction,
Oh, yeah.
the film. And I wanted to ask you first if you've seen it, and if you have seen it, what is your critique or commentary on it? I thought it was, and I told him, I thought it was a magnificent failure for various reasons,
Oh,
right?
okay.
I thought it was, okay, but
Mhm.
I'm more interested in your.
Okay. Well, my husband and I loved it. And thought it was very funny, but also, we particularly enjoyed the side about the family. If you know, my memoir, Old in Art School, one of the themes throughout it is that I was then in my 60s, and part of my life was taking care of my parents. And the issue of one's parents in that story, I think, was really important. But I would say overall, I could nitpick some stuff, the part about the book prize jury. I've served on book prize juries, and they're not that mean anymore. No, but what I mean, remember the scene where there are two Black people, which would be would only happen these days. But both of the Black people on the jury agreed on not wanting to give the prize to Fuck. And the jury overwhelmed them. I don't think that would happen. Two people, no, especially the only two Black people. But overall, I really enjoyed it. And was it Salamisha Tillett who also wrote about the question about what Black authors can write and publish? You didn't ask the question that I'm about to answer, but I would say, you remember the brouhaha about American Dirt, the book that the white woman wrote about the family, the migrant family, and there was all this dust up about who was she to write the book. I suspect, well, I'll just give you my sense of what that meant. I can tell you that non-white writers have been writing stuff forever. The problem is getting it out in the world. And so for me, the issue was not, could this white woman write that book about these people? Of course she could. Anybody can write anything. The question is the infrastructure of the publishing industry that let you know about that book, made it into a bestseller because people learned about it, whereas there are hundreds and maybe thousands of writers of color whose books are just unknown. So it's about publicity and marketing and all that stuff that's in publishing that is not the book.
Before we close, I want to ask one thing, which is maybe a slightly different tack. Some years ago, you gave a talk. I want to say it was at the Association of Black Women Historians. I could be wrong about that. But it was titled Notes for Black Women on Surviving in Academia.
Yeah, and for others.
And for others. Yeah. And I remember that because I found it to be so useful to me.
As an other.
But also, it was a kind of advice that was given, a secondhand dispensation to everyone I encountered who was dealing with any of the things that you talked about. And I wonder if you could just, for the good number of us who are in academia here, And for a good number of us who are in any array of arenas where this might be useful to think about, I wonder if you could just encapsulate that
Oh, boy.
as a closing note.
Okay. Let's see. Part of it was everybody in that room wanted to do something against racism and sexism. And how many times had I heard people say, I don't want you or somebody younger you to go through what I went through. I want to fix my institution. I want to fix the system. And I said, no, it's too big. White supremacy is too big. And as Toni Morrison says, the role of racism in our society is to keep you from doing your work. So your work is the first thing. And then find some place where you can make a difference and you can see the difference. Maybe you can count it up, or you can help somebody with their dissertation or their application for a fellowship, but don't try to fix something that is so big that it will take over your life and get in the way of your work. That was one thing. And another thing that people have come up to me for years afterwards, somebody mentioned it at Deborah Gray White's symposium last month. Mammy comes with a sunset clause that you don't have to spend your entire life fixing things for the race or the sex, that you do the things that you can do. And then when you get old, you retire.
So I'll say that to close where we started, I was inspired when I first encountered your work. And I was awestruck as I began to read more of your work and understand the multiple levels upon which you had achieved and made really significant contributions. And now, 30 years after I first read anything by you, I'm happy to be here and read your work. I just keep talking and continue to be impressed and inspired by the work that you've created. And so thank you. And on behalf of everyone who's here, thank you.
Thank you, Jelani. And thank you.